is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you? But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years.
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came.
Years and years, and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations. And
Cory Booker put Marco Rubio on the spot over Venezuela, accusing the administration of protecting American interests while sending Venezuelans back into a country his own State Department warns is dangerous. Rubio pushed back, and Booker wasn't backing down.
You issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security services, the colectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know, what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias? Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
There has been a significant development since this hearing. On August 14th, Venezuela's interim government announced measures affecting 131 prisoners, including people rights groups identify as political detainees. Human rights monitors said dozens had already been released, although hundreds of political prisoners reportedly remained. That means the human rights concerns raised in this exchange are still directly relevant.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst-case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested, of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you have these colectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone, let's flood over there, let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
The latest federal records still show Venezuela's TPS status under litigation, with some Venezuelan beneficiaries retaining protection while the courts consider the government's termination. And the issue has continued to affect people directly. In August, ICE detained a Venezuelan pastor in Houston whose TPS had been revoked.
Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop. And I think
just on 2 points. We're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to transition away from what's happening now. And as I said, we're not even 4 weeks into this thing. And if it continues to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, if progress isn't being made, we'll have very different feelings about it. But what we're cooperating on is not the continuation of what's happening. It's a movement away from all this and transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like this. That's the goal. But it's been less than 4 weeks. I mean, we think we've made substantial progress in a very short period of time. But I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state that we want.
The situation Booker warned about has changed dramatically since this hearing. 7 months after the U.S. intervention that removed Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela is now being governed on an interim basis by Delcy Rodriguez, while Washington continues trying to shape the country's political transition. On August 4, 2026, a bipartisan group of U.S. senators led by Ted Cruz and Jeanne Shaheen introduced a resolution calling for free and fair elections in Venezuela, the release of political prisoners, and sanctions against those obstructing democratic participation. The resolution reflects growing concern in Congress that the transition has not yet produced a clear democratic end state. Human rights concerns also remain relevant to Booker's warning. On August 14th, Venezuela's interim government announced the release of 131 political prisoners, which Marco Rubio described as an important step toward national reconciliation. But human rights groups say the broader detention problem remains unresolved, with hundreds of political prisoners still reported to be in custody. At the same time, Venezuela's relationship with Washington has continued to change economically and diplomatically. In August, BP announced a major offshore gas development in Venezuela, following other foreign energy investments as U.S. policy has shifted toward rebuilding the country's energy sector after Maduro's removal. That current context makes Booker's exchange with Rubio particularly significant. Booker's central concern was the contradiction between cooperating with Venezuela's new authorities while simultaneously acknowledging that serious human rights abuses, armed groups, and criminal organizations remained active inside the country. He pointed specifically to the security environment and warned that the United States could not claim to be stabilizing Venezuela while potentially providing resources to people or institutions connected to repression. Rubio's answer was essentially that the cooperation was intended to produce the opposite result. He argued that Washington was not working with Venezuela's authorities to preserve the old system. Instead, the administration was trying to use its influence to move Venezuela toward a fundamentally different political and security structure. That distinction is important because it creates two very different ways of evaluating the policy. Booker's question was, what is happening to Venezuelans right now? Rubio's answer was, where is this transition ultimately supposed to take Venezuela? Those are not necessarily the same thing. Booker also challenged the administration over its treatment of Venezuelans already living in the United States. He argued that it was contradictory to warn Americans about kidnapping, arbitrary detention, and repression in Venezuela, while simultaneously removing protections for Venezuelans living in the United States and sending some people back. Rubio defended the administration's decision by arguing that the Venezuelan population covered by temporary protections had become so large that the government believed it needed to reassess individual cases and conduct additional vetting. That issue has since become much more complicated. The legal fight over Venezuelan temporary protected status continued after the hearing. A January 2026 Ninth Circuit decision ruled that the administration's attempt to terminate the Venezuelan TPS designation exceeded the Secretary's statutory authority and was arbitrary and capricious. Meanwhile, deportations continued. Human Rights Watch reported that thousands of Venezuelans were returned between February and July 2026 and raised serious concerns about the treatment of Venezuelans transferred to El Salvador and elsewhere. That gives Booker's warning a much larger context than it had on January 28th. He was essentially asking whether the United States could simultaneously claim that Venezuela remained dangerous enough to justify a Level 4 travel warning, while also arguing that Venezuela had entered a safe enough transition for Venezuelans to be returned. There's a legitimate policy distinction here. A country can be undergoing political transition while still being dangerous for ordinary people. But that is precisely why the human rights question remains important. The most recent political prisoner releases suggest that there has been some movement in the direction Rubio described. Yet the continued congressional pressure for elections and continued concerns over political detainees demonstrate that the transition is far from complete. The energy side of the transition creates another major question. The United States is increasingly encouraging investment in Venezuela's oil and gas sector. BP's August announcement of a new offshore gas project illustrates how quickly economic policy has shifted from isolating Venezuela toward rebuilding its energy industry. That creates an obvious tension with Booker's original concern about American resources reaching institutions or individuals connected to repression. If Washington is going to put money, investment, and economic resources into Venezuela, who controls those resources and how are they monitored? That question is especially important because Rubio told senators during the hearing that the administration's objective was not to preserve the existing system indefinitely. He described the policy as a transition towards something fundamentally different. 7 months later, the United States has clearly achieved some major changes. Maduro is no longer governing Venezuela, the interim government has released some political prisoners, and foreign investment is returning. But the harder question is whether those changes are producing the democratic and human rights transformation that Rubio promised. The August congressional resolution suggests that at least some senators believe the answer is still incomplete. And this is where Booker's questioning becomes more than a disagreement over Venezuela policy. His argument was essentially that the United States should judge the transition by what happens to Venezuelan people, not simply by whether Washington has better relations with the government in Caracas. Rubio's argument was that lasting improvement would take time and that the United States was only weeks into the transition when this hearing occurred. Now, 7 months later, there's more evidence to evaluate. Political prisoners have been released, but many concerns remain. Foreign investment is returning, but questions remain about who benefits. Washington has closer relations with Venezuela's interim government, but Congress is still demanding a clear path toward elections. So the debate has evolved from should the United States cooperate with Venezuela to a much harder question. Can the Trump administration turn its enormous leverage over Venezuela into a genuine democratic and human rights transition? Or will economic cooperation and strategic interests ultimately take priority over the protections Booker demanded? That is the real test of the policy Rubio defended in this hearing.